Thank you for joining us this morning for this very key event. As we've heard the speakers up to now, and I'm sure speakers through the day say what one thing's becoming clear over a period of time, that MSMEs are not just an important cog in the wheel of development of India, but they are actually the drivers, right? And I think the current government has created a lot of impetus for this sector. It's been pushing for the growth of MSMEs, and like we just heard, the gentleman from Niti Aayog say, the government wants to now see business take over business rather than being in business itself and be an enabler. I think that's that's something that's great. And I think over the past year, with initiatives like Atmanirbhar Bharat, as well as schemes like the ECLGS, there has been at least some amount of relief that MSMEs have had now with 2 years of the pandemic coming to a head. But at the end of the day, I think MSMEs will ultimately progress, and they will scale up only when they have the right conditions, as far as the right financial conditions available to them. Now, I was just reading some numbers interestingly, and we've had 58% more accounts that have got restructured in the 2 years since January 2020, when the pandemic obviously came into full effect in March, but we started seeing it emerging in Jan. But since then, 58% more accounts have been restructured. It's the numbers that I saw was some 58,500 crores of restructuring, as compared to 22,650 crores, representing close to 10 lakh accounts. Now, we just heard a number of about 6.8 million SMEs, and that represents about 15% of the SMEs that are currently with restructured accounts. And a very interesting thing that that we saw in one of the statements by the Finance Ministry in December, or was it late November, is that the growth in the number of accounts being restructured is actually slowed down in January 2021 onwards, possibly because of the ECLGS, because it helps avoiding the stressed account tag, which means that probably, while about 9.8 lakh restructured accounts represent maybe 15% of the estimate of SMEs in the country, MSMEs in the country, you're talking about, if we include ECLGS, probably close to 20% of the accounts in restructuring. Right. So, while we recognize MSMEs as the driver as one of the key drivers of the economy, the government has been taking a lot of initiatives. The RBI has been, trying to support as much as possible. But between you, you represent an industry chamber, you represent, the public sector, and you represent the private sector. So, I'd just like to go around, initially, and try to understand from you just, a freewheeling set of thoughts from each of you about where do you think the situation is now, as far as the financial situation, financial stress of the MSMEs is concerned, and where do you see it going in the next 12 months? So maybe we could kick this off with Mr. Srivastava. So what do you think the situation is now, and where do you see it going in the next 12 to 24 months?
Thank you, Prasar. Frankly, MSMEs they have very limited headroom to meet the volatilities in any times. And given the last 2 years, where we have had great unpredictability, great uncertainty, the MSMEs with very thin equity have very little headroom or very little wiggle room to actually maneuver themselves and continue to remain viable. So initially, when the ECLGS scheme was launched, it was meant for only standard assets, and then they made it up to SMA 1. But in my experience, I've found that there is a problem in MSMEs because of the fact that their working capital cycle gets elongated for reasons beyond their control, mostly reasons beyond their control. And when it gets elongated, they tend to service their interest and installment obligations only on the 88th or 89th day. So precluding SME tools from the ambit of restructuring was, in my view, not very prudent. And therefore, you had only 15% of the MSMEs who have actually been found eligible for the ECLJ schemes under 1, 2, 3, 4. It has been revised, it has been extended, additional funding has been done. But given the continued uncertainty and disruptions of the business, less so in this current Omicron situation, more in last year and before that, when there was a total lockdown disrupting the supply chain, the ability of MSMEs to maneuver through this being very limited, it gets impacted on one, their sales coming down, and two, their working capital cycle getting extended. Now, when they're operating on a very thin margin, their ability to generate operating profits to service both the interest and the installment then going forward becomes more suspect. Because as you know, they're then trading on very thin equity, because the equity gets eroded in the meanwhile and the leverage goes up. With the margins remaining the same, the ability to service future debt at the same level of activity, presuming that they go back to pre-COVID-19 situation, also becomes very thin. So in my view, that would require some amount of support going forward. Some restructuring would be required. Whether you extend the tenor, or you waive off the interest, or you pump in additional equity, or you write off some amount, I would assume that there would be a requirement for a few of these. Not the guys who have survived will survive, but there will be a large numbers who will go through this stress. And I think it's time that we revisited the entire thing in a more constructive manner. So the government has done a lot. It has done a lot in the last 2 years. Let me be candid about that.
I think you're absolutely right, sir. And, obviously I'll go to Mr. Tripathi now, since he's representing, because, to also get a view from the private sector. But before I do that, I had, one question which also I'd like to add to him, but, from you also, Mr. Srivastava, the ECLGS scheme or any of these restructuring schemes, the problem that I see in a lot of them is that, obviously a loan restructuring scheme can only work for a debtor, but, a scheme like ECLGS, which applies only to MSMEs that have zero debt, or that have existing debt, and leaves out MSMEs that have been, for example, performing well pre-pandemic with zero debt, right? How do you see us remedying that situation? Because that whole, investing in equity structure, in our view, it didn't work out so well because of, obviously the bureaucratic hurdles that come in its way. So do you think that there is a way that the scheme can be extended? Obviously 3.0 is now over, but if there were to be a 4.0, do you think that there is scope to extend the scheme to MSMEs that were doing really well before the pandemic, but have then, suffered during the pandemic? Obviously, because they also have the same concerns about, the thin equity that you talked about.
So I would answer this question in two parts. One is to take immediate steps to correct the situation with the existing MSME, and two, to create going forward an amenable situation for promoting or encouraging further MSMEs. Now, if you look at the first step of how do you protect the existing MSMEs, out of the total funding of around 4.5 lakh crores, only 3 or 3.1 lakh crores has been utilized. So there is headroom available for almost 1.4 lakh crores, and this scheme can definitely be extended. That's point number one. Point number two, if the MSME had been operationally viable in pre-COVID-19, which means that it had EBITDA level positive. Now in MSMEs, in the smaller and the micros, it becomes very difficult. So it will have to be judged on the basis of the account turnover only. So if there is a positive margin, then burdening them with higher amount of debt is really not going to make them more viable. So we'll have to find a solution to that. Now that can be that amount of debt can be subsidized, subsidy can be given, provided they continue to service for the next 1 or 2 years. It can be restructured, and through innovative structuring as well, in a period of 2 to 3 years, if they're able to meet their commitments on time, the debt which has been added on can be subsidized, or some sort of subsidy can be given over the next defined period of 3 to 5 years. That's one thought that I had.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. So, moving to Mr. Tripathi, so, obviously the same question to you. I mean, how do you see the situation? How is it evolving over the next 12 to 24 months? And, on the second part that I had kind of posed, how do you bring in MSMEs that were performing really well pre-pandemic, but have, suffered during the pandemic into the fold in a scheme that's easy to implement rather than, something that has to go through bureaucratic hurdles and, that kind of situation?
As Sunil sir already given some sort of light, but just to give a more perspective, what we understand that most of the restructuring happened in the second of Q4 and Q4 of 21 and the Q1 of the current financial year, right? So we believe that the actual impact would be visible largely at the end of this quarter and in the coming quarter. So because most of the loans were restructured with 12 months moratorium. So the real impact we would see in the banking system in Q4 of FY22 and Q1 FY23. And since most of these borrowers were impacted during the COVID, and unfortunately their moratorium end of moratorium period is coinciding with the third wave, right? So it's still evolving. May not have a same kind of disruption which we saw in wave 1 and wave 2, but still it yet to be assessed that how much impact it would have on the businesses, and specifically in the sectors like education, hospitality, aviation, some of these sectors which were deeply impacted, right? So surely these are the loans which are the most vulnerable. So as we speak, in the end of September, RBI data says about 2.85 lakh crores of standard restructured assets which were outstanding across banking system, out of which almost 34% were restructured in the COVID-1 scheme and almost 40% in the COVID-2 scheme. And most of these were MSMEs, right? As Mr. Srivastava has mentioned, the capital formation in the country has been really a problem, right? So most of these entities are thinly capitalized. The support in terms of ECLGS, etc., had played, but it did a limited role, right, which they could have played on the viability of business. So as a bank, we see that there could be a evolution of three kind of a borrower. One, which are typically they've been able to repay and sustain. They have a very viable business model, and they will continue to flourish. The second set of customers would be the business is viable, but the bank need to support, the ecosystem need to support them in terms of additional funding, providing them additional capital. And the third is actually unviable businesses, where the institution need to take a call that through some resolution process, maybe bankruptcy or maybe some other resolution process, because business itself is not viable. So putting additional debt may not help the that particular sector, right? We believe that there could be a few intervention from government, which could help really. There could be one on the restructuring side, a little intervention, which may not be a widely sort of for every sector. There could be a sector-specific second restructuring option to be given amid wave 3 of COVID, which is Omicron, and especially on the receivable side, these entities, actually smaller entities, struggle a lot. Though TRED's platform have been there in the system, existence, but if you see, the participation is really low, and still most of the SMEs which actually supplies to the other, the micro enterprises supplies to the MSMEs, are not part of that framework, right? Because the MSMEs which supplies to the large corporate and well-rated corporates, only those are trading their, I would say, discounting their receivables on the platforms like TRED. So insurance, something like a receivable insurance, can definitely play a role, right? Which is something, as we hear that something which is going on around this, but there is something which, if it comes up, and so the not so well-rated anchor, I would say, can also participate. So I would say the micro enterprises which is supplying to the lower end of MSMEs can also participate in the discounting process, wherein the working capital cycle at least can be eased. That's the another area which we see, which is very good help. I think third, which you mentioned, Prasar, right? The equity participation, that the entire scheme wasn't so designed very keeping in mind that easy accessibility. If the whole scheme can be reassessed, it's not a slight modification, whole scheme can be reassessed and looked at it, that whether the viable businesses, the category 2 businesses which I mentioned, can be supported through that scheme, will definitely help to revive some of the sectors.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Tripathi. I appreciate it. Obviously, my next round of questions after, we've heard Mr. Gupta would have been in terms of what the government can do. You've already kind of given us a little bit of insight into what your thoughts are, but we'll come back to that in a little more detail in a minute. I'd like to, kind of dig into that a little more. But, coming to Mr. Gupta, so you've now, in a way, you're representing the industry, and you've heard from a banker with experience in the public sector. You heard from a private sector banker. What do you see as the situation, and how do you see the banks playing a key role in helping evolve the situation to to being much better, say 12 months or 24 months down the line?
So thank you very much, and perhaps I'll take you to the different aspect of this restructuring debate which we are doing nowadays. Perhaps our discussion so far has been limited to the emergency credit guarantee line. To me, ECGL is not for the restructuring of the loan. It was an additional loan which was given to the enterprise and the enterprises, MSMEs, which are either standard or SMA 0 or SMA 1. So they were not largely requiring the restructuring, in fact, in most of the cases. Because what we could understand from the bankers itself that, yes, there are cases where the MSMEs are in deep stress. There are certain sectors. And this emergency credit line loan has helped them, in fact, in a big way to come out of the liquidity problem. But many of the MSMEs are those which were not requiring these loans, in fact. And what they did, in fact, because this loan was of a low rate of interest, so what they did, in fact, they repaid the high cost debt out of this emergency credit line. The important scheme which was launched, in fact, for the restructuring of this MSME loan was subordinate debt to stressed or NPA MSME. That was the very important scheme. 20,000 crore rupees was earmarked for that scheme, and perhaps that was the scheme for the restructuring of the MSME loan. There were two schemes being launched by Reserve Bank of India in 2 different years. That those schemes were definitely for the standard assets, but this is the subordinate debt scheme to NPA and stress assets was actually meant for the restructuring of the stressed MSMEs. But unfortunately, the scheme was so drafted that out of 20,000 crore rupees, I'm not aware of the current figure, but maybe less than 100 crore, because some days ago it was about 20-30 crore rupees. So maximum 100 crore as of today might have been disbursed. And this scheme was for, additional loan in the form of equity, because this loan was given to the promoters, and then promoters were required to pump in this money in the business as their equity. And whenever this loan was to be given to the MSMEs, the restructuring was a mandatory condition, because without restructuring, this loan was not possible. We had meeting with Ministry of MSMEs. We had meeting with the IBA jointly also, and we suggested many changes to be done in this scheme. Perhaps some changes or the scheme with many changes will come out soon, and perhaps that will be the time when actually the restructuring will be possible. The important thing which I want to emphasize here, the restructuring is very rare in case of MSMEs, because what bankers feel normally whenever any account is in stress or it is converted to NPA, the only action they need to take is recovery of the loan, in fact, not the restructuring. But yes, in many cases that may be the condition, because the unit may not be viable. But the way this subordinate debt scheme has been drafted, a lot of changes have to be done. Second thing, very important aspect Mr. Vivek Tripathi has referred here is the delayed payment to these MSMEs. I suppose this is the main root cause of stress amongst these MSMEs, because what happens when these MSMEs supply goods or services to their buyers, maybe MSMEs as he was referring, or even to the large corporate, or even to the government companies for that purposes, I will say, because not that every bill of these MSMEs being issued to the large corporate or to the government or to the PSUs is discounted on trade platform. This is not a fact. So in most of the cases, and the government as Minister of MSME, the then Minister of MSME, Mr. Gadkari, has many times has told that so much of amount is stuck up with the PSUs, with the government departments, with the large corporates. Even I have seen that the Prime Minister has also referred in a recent AGM of FICCI that these large corporates or the PSUs or the government companies should timely repay or pay to these MSMEs. There are certain provisions in the MSMED Act that these have to be paid within 45 days. Otherwise, interest at the rate of 3 times of bank rate need to be paid to these MSMEs. But this is the biggest problem, because their cash flow is largely affected due to non-payment. As Mr. Tripathi was referring to, yes, something is to be done. So we at Chamber of Indian Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises, I would like to inform to the large number of viewers through this Businessworld platform that we at Chamber of Indian Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises have initiated and started a portal in the name of nodefaulters.com. So it's a nodefaulters.com, wherein anybody who is having this problem may come and may report its default. What we are doing, we are requesting their buyers. We are sending the phone calls to them, we are sending the WhatsApp to them, we are sending the messages to them on behalf of these MSMEs and requesting them that please pay to these MSMEs, because these MSMEs are the engine growth for the economy of the country. And in case some conciliation, some negotiation, some arbitration is required, we are helping them. I would like to just share one data. In fact, we started this nodefaulters.com about 10 days back. As on today, more than 650 crore defaults have been reported on this nodefaulters.com. So this is the number, in fact, which speaks everything, that what pain these MSMEs are facing. I feel that these MSMEs mostly don't require additional fund. They don't require the restructuring if their payment is made on time by their buyers. And the second thing, that RBI should also consider restructuring of these MSMEs, even if they are into NPA category. Only then perhaps the actual support of these MSME will be there.
I think great insights, Mr. Gupta, especially about nodefaulters.com. Given the scale that you're talking about, I think it should have been talked much more, including by us in the media. So I think that's something that at least we at our end should certainly remedy. But I think that's it's heartening to hear the kind of initiatives that you're talking. And just to go back to the starting of your point, I think yes, the idea is to talk about restructuring. The idea is also to talk about how MSMEs can survive the financial risks that go through. And therefore, I think while we did talk about the impact of ECLGS on restructuring, I think the insights that you've given on the specific restructuring schemes is very helpful. Now, I think there are two key questions that I'd like to kind of pose back to the panel, and I'll come back to Mr. Srivastava. That obviously Mr. Tripathi did talk a little about what more the government can do. Mr. Gupta has given us insights in terms of, what are the pain points that they're suffering. I think one theme that also has come across is that there are receivables, there are valid receivables that most MSMEs have, and seems to be becoming a vicious cycle. Mr. Tripathi did talk about receivables insurance, but is there some way where we can verify and validate the receivables, for example, and make sure that where an organization that is on the verge of defaulting or has defaulted but has valid receivables or validated receivables, for example, in conjunction with, let's say, an initiative like nodefaulters.com to, prevent default by saying that, look, yes, they have valid receivables. Maybe it would mean that we'll have to kind of, add a little more interest when these receivables are recovered, or, work with nodefaulters.com to, recover these receivables. So, it's just one point that I'm trying to kind of, granularize, but the idea is that what can the government do better? What can the banks do better to support the government in that scheme?
Yeah, Prasar. So this is Mr. Mukesh Mohan Gupta raised a very valid point, and that is the uncertainty over which the poor MSMEs have no control, because they are at the mercy of the larger, their own buyers. Towards that, we had made a very strong case stating that all public sector and all large corporates should be compulsorily accepting the bills in the trade platform. Now, there was an issue that how do they return the goods which are found to be not of that quality? And that is where it is stuck. So while the risk transference takes place, the risk is transferred from the MSME to the larger player, the issue of the return of things, and that is an indeterminate. So what I would suggest is that the government should come with a absolute notification that everybody who is registered on the Udyam, their bills would be accepted on the TREDS platform, and 1 month from the date of the bill, which means after they have the buyer has received the goods, within which period they have to inspect and return. Otherwise, the bill gets compulsorily traded there, and then at increased cost for every period that can be worked out. But unless there is a fiat from the government that every bill which is raised by an Udyam registered MSME has to be put in the platform, and it has to be accepted by all the buyers, and this will be compulsory traded. 1 month is the maximum time to be given to them for their inspection and return.
Yeah, sir, I just want to add two things here. In fact, one, you very rightly told about this Udyam registration. Sir, you will be definitely be knowing and aware of the fact that what is the situation of Udyam registration as on today. There were Udyog registration, in fact, earlier for the MSME registration, which was discontinued during 2020. As of today, and when this was discontinued, the total Udyog registration were in the range of 1 crore. Wherein we talk about more than 6 crore MSMEs in the country. Where are those 6 crore MSMEs? I really don't know. The second issue is when they discontinued this Udyog Aadhaar registration and this Udyam registration was introduced. As on today, what is the situation? We are hardly about 50 lakhs being registered on Udyam registration. And you will be surprised, sir, that more than 90% are the micro enterprises, meaning thereby that small and medium enterprises are not very keen, in fact, to be registered on Udyam registration. One reason may be, to me, that out of this MSME, the last M, which is the medium enterprise, doesn't have any facility under this MSMED Act. So this is the problem. As far as you told that deemed acceptance, perhaps you are referring to that whenever these MSMEs raise any bill, so it should be considered as deemed acceptance of the invoices. Perhaps you are referring to this. So, sir, I would just like to add that under the MSMED Act, Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises Development Act, there is a specific provision of this deemed acceptance of the invoices. And it has been referred that if within 15 days of issuance of any invoice, no objection or no dispute is raised by the buyer, it should be treated as deemed acceptance. The problem is there are certain very good provisions in the MSMED Act as far as the payment to these MSMEs, as far as the deemed acceptance of the invoices, but actual implementation is not happening. That is the issue. So we have suggested many changes to the Government of India, to the Ministry of MSME, like Samadhan is there. Like we started this no defaulters, the same way the Government of India, Ministry of MSME has the Samadhan portal. The problem is that as per the MSMED Act, the disposal of the cases being registered on this Samadhan portal is 90 days. So within 90 days, these cases should be disposed of. Situation is the cases of more than a year or 2 years are still pending. because the problem is that the chairman of these facilitation council is normally the director of industries or a very senior officer who definitely has a lot of responsibilities, other responsibility than the cases being dealt with these MSCFCs. The other suggestions we gave to the government that whenever any MSCFC pass any order, please upload it on a centralized portal so that if I want to deal with some XYZ company, I should be able to do a due diligence whether that this company is paying regularly to their buyers or not, which is not happening as of today. So we suggested that like we can search out any order from at the Supreme Court, at the High Court, at the NCLT, NCLT website. The similar way should be there in the Samadhan portal, that it will be a good for the due diligence. And now no defaulters, what we did in fact, a very specific thing we introduced on this nodefaulters.com. Whenever any MSME would be interested to deal with any of the new buyer, he or she can go to this portal, and there is a tab called Find Defaulters. He can just search on Find Defaulter. He can search that whether the company with whom they want to deal with has already defaulted to, and if they have defaulted to, with so many, and how many suppliers have they defaulted, what is the amount involved, so that they are, at the first stage, they are being cautioned that, this company is not paying to their suppliers regularly. They have a lot of cases being pending. So we should not deal with them. Perhaps this will work as a name and shame also to these companies, and they will also think, no, we should not come on this portal. We should pay to the suppliers on time. So that is a small initiative being taken by us. Hope we'll be able to get some success with the support of all the maybe MSMEs, large corporate and the government companies.
It's as we say, there's always many a slip between the cup and the lip, and I think in India, like we've seen that structurally, in terms of policies, in terms of scheme, everything is there. Before I come to and we're about to run out of time, so I come to Mr. Tripathi for his final comments as well. But I need to tell you about this anecdote that I heard from a very senior hotelier about a great scheme that was drafted by the government, and on the very last page, a clever bureaucrat wrote that it applies only to new projects, which means it was useless for the existing industry. So I think that's something that we all need to go over. So before we run out of time, Mr. Tripathi, I'd like to hear your closing comments on what you think can be done to do this better for MSMEs, to make sure that the kind of angst that Mr. Gupta is communicating is reduced at the earliest.
So I think Mr. Gupta has given really some of the valid suggestions, and coupled with some of the solutions I mentioned. The other point, like if you would see, there have been a great offtake of ECLGS scheme, right? Because it was made simple, and the only difference between the existing, your ECLGS and CGTMSE and Mudra is that ECLGS was largely meant for your operational expenses during the stress situation. So I think now what we see that the next couple of years is going to be a great wave of capex cycles in India, and to support most of the MSME, which would eventually the capex cycles would trickle down to the smaller players as well. To support them, I think the government can actually evaluate how the CGTMSE kind of a scheme can be redrafted, and the ambit of the scheme can be increased. Today it is really cumbersome to claim, the claim process itself is cumbersome. The coverage is very, very low. So when any project is being financed by a lending institution, there could be a part of capital contribution and then obviously the lender's contribution. But apart from project assets, sometimes it becomes challenging for promoters or the entrepreneur to bring additional collateral, in terms of security. So if project fails, there is a fallback option, right? And if it is implemented in a right manner, I think it could be one of the greatest support to the new ventures and existing brownfield expansion as well, right? So I would rest my point here that the viable business should be supported in in a best possible manner. There could be various means and ways, including some of the suggestions mentioned by Forum, can be implemented and applied.
Right. Thank you so much. So I think we are out of time. We had a great spirited discussion. I think so many points were raised. I think we can have one whole panel session on each of these points. But I think it's always important to ignite the debate. It's always important to understand the concerns so that they can be addressed. And I thank you all for taking the time this morning and for this spirited debate, for giving us so many points to think about. And I think at least at Businessworld, we'll try and circle back to each one of you to try and see how we can push on each of these things further into the debate and see how if we can make a small difference at our level. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I appreciate it.